Hello, and welcome to the Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun, and today we have special guest Patrick LeMieux. Hey, Patrick, how are you doing?
Hello, doing good. Really happy to be here and to be talking with you today.
I'm very excited to chat with you as well. Patrick, you're an assistant professor at the University of California, Davis, and you play, make, research, discuss, live games and metagames. And we were originally going to chat with you and Stephanie Boluk, who you were a co-author with on a book called Metagaming. But unfortunately, Stephanie couldn't join us today. We're still really stoked to chat with you about all sorts of things, about RPGs and remaking and wherever that might take us.
Yeah.
Just an initial question. Sorry, go on.
No. Feel free. This is going to be our stutter step throughout the interview.
Yeah, exactly. Well, how did you get where you are now? I'm quite curious.
Oh, wow. Okay. This is an interesting kind of way to get into this conversation because for the longest time, I did like an undergrad in architecture, and then I did like an MFA in media art, and I did like a PhD. And I only realized at the end of my PhD, hey, wait, like the thing that ties together all my interests and all my output and all this stuff is actually video games. And I guess I'd been like looking for other things, but the first video game I made was an RPG Maker game that I made in high school. And I made it for the entire duration of high school as like a hobby. Though I did sell it for $5 a chapter. They're like 5-hour chapters. And I would make new 5 hours of content every year of high school in an attempt to get to around 20 hours, which was like, I was trying to hit like a Chrono Trigger kind of metric. Like if I could get like a 20-hour experience. But every time I'd release it, it'd be, the first ones were just on like burned CDs with like Sharpie on them. And they got like more sophisticated. So by the end, they were on like micro CDs with like a graphic and like a little jewel case in different colors, and you could pick the color you wanted. And I would, every time I'd release a new chapter of the RPG Maker game, I would update and edit the stuff I had worked on. So from like, I don't know, like from when I was, when do you start high school? Like 14? Till when I was like 18, I was working on this game, and I had to kind of like update past versions of myself as I kind of became who I am. And then throughout like the next, 20 years, I tried to find all these other things to do and just kept coming back to games. And so that game in particular is like a weird touchstone for me, even though I've never really published it online. It was only published in like physical form.
Do you still have these CDs floating around? Do they exist in the universe?
Yeah, they do. The CDs exist. I don't have any around here. And I have like digital copies of the game. So sometimes I like open it up and look at my code and think about it a little bit. And weirdly, a cousin of a friend, when the COVID pandemic started, reached out to me and was like, "Hey, do you still have that game you made? I've been like feeling nostalgic, and I'd like to play it." So I sent a digital copy for the first time to this like one person.
Yes. Did you charge him $5?
I probably should have like put up the little Venmo. Yeah. But no. He already had bought multiple copies, I'm sure, back in the day. So
yeah, you gotta milk the true fans. That's it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's been like in the back of my mind.
The kind of game that you created is an RPG. What is an RPG?
Yeah. Good question. So there are a couple different flavors of RPG. There are like, I think the major designations, we won't go too in the weeds, but like computer RPGs, you might think of kind of the Elder Scrolls or Fallout, or like maybe Deus Ex or something, where there's a lot of kind of character customization, open world. Maybe The Witcher fits in here. A lot of these are made in Europe and the Americas, so sometimes they're called the Western RPG, but computer RPG, I think, makes a lot of sense. They have a lineage that follows things like D&D, although there's a lot of other inspirations. And then the JRPG, the Japanese RPG or console RPG, kind of is like a spin-off of some of these. So it has a funny origin where Yuji Horii and Nakamura were, I think, in like an Enix contest, like a magazine contest to write a piece of software when they were making their studio. And they won it, and the prize was to go to like Apple World in California in like 1983, I think. And when they flew out there, there's actually a fantastic manga called The Road to Dragon Quest that like depicts these moments of them like flying to the States and seeing Steve Jobs on stage and all this stuff. But that's where they saw Wizardry and Ultima for the first time. And Wizardry has this kind of turn-based, menu-driven, first-person combat, and Ultima has these kinds of top-down, bird's-eye view towns where you control an avatar in 2D. And so they flew back to Japan, and they were trying to figure out how do we combine these two things. And the result was Dragon Quest, which is this game for the Nintendo Famicom that had Yuji Horii was a staff person at Shonen Jump. So one of the managers there kind of got him to
Shonen Jump is like a manga collection for kids, right?
Yeah, it's like a weekly manga collection, kind of aimed at boys, young boys. It's kind of the shonen genre is a lot of like adventure stories. But Akira Toriyama made Dragon Ball, which is very popular, and so they got Akira Toriyama's art in Dragon Quest. So suddenly you have these kind of like cartoon manga influenced characters showing up in the first person combat of Wizardry, which used to be on this kind of black screen with line drawn characters. And they got Koichi Sugiyama, who had made music for commercials, TV shows, anime, to do the music. So you have this kind of like orchestral-ish chiptune going on. And so the big innovations, I think, with the JRPG or the console RPG was this bright, evocative tone, reminiscent of kind of manga adventure stories, with these kind of cute drawings, a kind of treatment of the music, and then an approach to linear storytelling that isn't really part of the history of the CRPG, which are much more open-ended, and you can kind of choose your own path. And in a computer RPG, you might customize your character a very specific way, and then choose, I'm going to be a thief in Skyrim or something.
Mm. It strikes me that the things that make console RPGs, yeah,
Go
so
ahead.
like they codified really early on. It sounds like even the very first JRPGs. Also confusing when you say console versus computer, and they both start with a C. So maybe we need the J.
The J. It's funny because the Japaneseness of the JRPG is really important, but also JRPGs are kind of made everywhere. So maybe as we'll talk about later, there's like a lot of interesting JRPGs coming out of North America right now as well.
Right, like the modern JRPG, or even Australia, even.
Yeah, definitely.
And you mentioned that your undergraduate was archaeology, which sounds
architecture.
Completely. I'm sorry, architecture. Wait, hang on.
Yeah. Closer, but yeah.
Maybe I think I got confused because something that you do perform is like media archaeology, or this process of looking at the materiality and historicity of video games.
Yeah.
And maybe also looking at the architecture of them by extension. Can you talk really briefly just to give some more context to some of those works?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that happens a lot in my artistic practice is a kind of referentiality to previous art historical moments or game design moments, where a lot of the projects I work on are kind of remakes, essentially, of other people's work or of other ideas, right? So thinking about the original context, thinking about the contemporary context or how those projects have been historicized, and then using the process of remaking, of actually getting in the nitty gritty of desoldering stuff or putting stuff together or reprogramming things. Or I do a lot of work on kind of like 8-bit retro software and hardware. And when you start to do that and think about like a contemporary audience, and also how those original works have been historicized, like all this interesting stuff pops up that you wouldn't expect. So one of my projects, Triforce, which you can find on itch.io, starts as like a pretty legit Unity remake of the original Legend of Zelda, where we like used Stephanie Bullock and I used FCEUX to like measure all the animations and try and figure out like all the specifics, basically reverse engineering the mechanics and then rewriting them for Unity. And then it kind of uses the engine's capabilities to go in other places. Likewise, something like Coin Heaven, which is this kind of remake of Cory Arcangel's Super Mario Clouds piece, started by just trying to make Super Mario Clouds myself. And something else happened along the way that gives you some insight into both the original piece and where we're sitting today, and the kinds of technologies and kinds of networks that we're plugged into that are really different from when people were making games, you know, at the offices of Enix in the mid 80s or whatever.
And I find this approach really fascinating because it is so distinct from people who are using games as an aesthetic inquiry, because you are really messing around with the guts of these games. Like when you say you're soldering, you're sometimes having to ROM hack physically or do these really specific like pin, modifications on a hardware. So it created a bit of a discourse, right? Like CloudGate, so to speak, among some media theorists.
The rumbling thunder of CloudGate, I can still hear it kind of in the background of my life every once in a while, which is just that, some folks weren't sure about the types of things that are revealed when you kind of start to look at the original hardware and what that means in terms of authenticity or like mastery of technologies. And I'm interested in those questions as well.
And I've asked, we've had, for example, Nicole He on the show and kind of discussed the question of like, how important is it to an art piece that the technology is real? You know, that what you're presenting to the audience as happening is actually happening. And it's a tricky line to walk.
Yeah. A cheeky answer is it's important if those are the things you want to talk about conceptually along with the work. If those aren't the things you want to talk about conceptually with the work, then it's not important.
That's, I think, the right answer, honestly, from my perspective, in addition to being a bit cheeky. And so your work involving remaking is now, in a very recursive, discursive kind of way, going to be looking at not just games as a remediated medium, but also like specific games that you're remaking. What's on your plate at the moment?
Okay, so I think this is a good transition into some of the classes I teach at UC Davis. So I'm really lucky to teach like a senior level small studio every year or every couple of years that is a kind of a single game class. And I use this as both like, this is almost like closer to my research and my methodology than even like the grad classes I teach that are more like media theory classes. So the undergrads and I kind of pick a game and we try and completely deconstruct like that one game, almost like in the tradition of kind of big book classes. You might take a class just on Moby Dick or something like that. So what if you took a class that's just on Super Mario Brothers? So you might try and play that game or make a let's play of that game or speedrun that game or try and desolder the elements of the controller and build a new, maybe you want a rapid fire controller, or maybe you want a controller that auto runs Mario. Maybe you'd try and rip the game data to make a legal ROM of your copy of Super Mario Brothers and then edit that ROM to make a ROM hack and put it all together to make some kind of unique control scheme for a ROM hack of Mario all running on original hardware. I also did a class on Doom, which was really similar, where it's like, my students have never even seen an image of Doom. So let's like learn how to play it, learn how to do kind of like, we use JP LeBreton's kind of game tour methodology where you turn off all the enemies and you use a lot of cheat codes to survey all the architecture and walk through the game. We learned how to speedrun it and do specific tricks, and eventually learned how to make new maps and texture those maps and ultimately make total conversion games using the Doom engine. So the latest class in this series of kind of single game classes was a little bit different because it wasn't just a single game necessarily. It was a class on RPG Maker 2000, which is the kind of software that, again, that I was working on in high school. I think your first digital game was also an RPG Maker 2000 game. The class was called 20 Years of RPG Maker 2000. And it was a kind of survey of both the console or JRPG form, like where does that come from? These stories about kind of Yuji Horii and Dragon Quest up through the kind of what I think of as like the animeification of JRPGs with Final Fantasy VII, as well as kind of the explosion of like the budget of these games. And then into kind of indie games made in the 2000s using RPG Maker. We were looking at things like Space Funeral or Yume Nikki, into the types of things that indie game makers are doing with the RPG format. So something like Undertale is like the end point, and maybe contrasting Undertale with stuff like the Final Fantasy VII Remake or Dragon Quest X. And in order to do this, we used RPG Maker 2000 as our lens to kind of think about attitudes toward this form at different time periods, kind of sampling the fan games around the system, as well as building our own games. So the students learned how to script and edit in RPG Maker 2000, use their own graphics and rip graphics. They had to make a demake of one of their favorite RPGs. So rip graphics from games, rip MIDI from, or find ways to get MIDI from games, or compose your own MIDI. And then they had to do a music project also, where a lot of them made original music compositions, all kind of getting ready to release a demo of their own JRPG game, which they recently did, like just a couple of weeks ago, which has been extremely exciting to kind of see people get to know this technology, to touch base with my own understanding of it, and also to learn a lot about the JRPG and what it means in different time periods. Like 8-bit Nintendo JRPGs like Mother and Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy means something really different than Final Fantasy VII means. Or even the 16-bit ones, where they kind of come into their own form and kind of solidify a lot of the conventions around like Earthbound or Chrono Trigger or Dragon Quest V maybe. And then, you know, everything kind of gets turned on its head a bit in the PlayStation era. So coming out of that, what kind of games do you make in this format is one of our questions.
I'm in love with this approach to games pedagogy, because I think one of the central question educators are facing is games is not one thing, right? It's like trying to teach all of moving images as a medium in a class, which is just possible. So the idea of like, let's look at just a specific inquiry that may or may not relate to your practice, but through the lens of either one game or one engine. I'm reminded of it's a piece called Fish by Robin Sloan. It's a TAP essay, and it's really good. And it talks about going to art school, and the professor made everyone just like look at a fish, a dead fish, and just look at it. And the first multiple classes of this art school experience was just looking at a fish. And the process
sounds kind of like classic art school, yeah.
Yeah, who knows if this is real? Maybe this is the archetypical story that, you know, they tell you happens and no one actually ever does it. But, you know, this idea of looking at the object and accessing it with different tools or methodologies, but training yourself to rethink games through that lens is really nice.
Yeah, this is why I always try, like, if ever I'm like writing about a game, okay, so what did speedrunners do? What do the tool assisted people do? What do the modders do? What do the fanfic folks do? Like, what do cosplayers do? Like, what is the interest around what kinds of metagames do these games generate? And how does that give me some kind of insight into how people play? And what's really fun about these classes is not just getting into the nitty gritty, and also learning about like history, right, of those different moments, whether it's kind of the corporate history of Nintendo and the Mario class, or the history of kind of Doom and computer games more generally, or this really specific kind of history of almost like the rise of anime as a global media form through the RPG Maker class. I think doing it with a lot of people has been a really good, because you learn so much from the way that people approach the projects and have different interests. And that was really exciting in the RPG Maker class.
Yeah, I guess like my personal, not extension, but takeaway from metagaming, which asserts that the biggest trick that video games ever played on us is that, you know, video games are not just a medium for creating metagames. I can't remember the exact wording, but this is from the blurb, slash something that I try to quote all the time, because I truly believe it. I think it's really important to see it as the medium for creating metagames. My takeaway from that is that it's actually about how people access the work. So it's not even just about the games that they create, it's about the they question. And the notion that, when you're looking, you mentioned speedrunners or fanfic people, it's like, oh, those are all people making this stuff. And that's what's interesting to me. So I think it's nicely reflected in your articulation that it's exciting to do it with people because they're presenting their perspectives. Like, that's the core of it.
Yeah. And the kind of conclusion was, oh, wow, we have all these folks in 2020, like during this global pandemic, spending some time reflecting on these kind of meditative durational games, because to play JRPG means you are having multiple sessions over a long period of time. I think Dragon Quest X is like well over 100 hours, at least in my experience.
It's absurd.
Yeah, so you're like, it's like a TV show though. You're like tuning in every night for 30 minutes or fairy tales, right? The bedtime stories kind of medium. And so that kind of is interesting alongside kind of adjusting to the pace of being in one space under lockdown or in quarantine. And then alongside that, making some RPGs in 2020 seems very interesting, like temporally. Like, what can this form say about like duration or memory or nostalgia or documentation? A lot of students made like one of the first assignments was to use RPG Maker to make like a week diary, like a day-by-day story of like what happens in your house or your bedroom or something. So there are these little records, these little like durational records, and I'd like to imagine playing those one day at a time over like a week or something, almost like a Carrot Stone project or something like that.
Carrot Stone is a game designer who often does games about ritual and I guess like time.
Yeah, like Ritual of the Moon is a great game that you have to kind of play daily for a little bit of time, for 30 days, I think.
And like this connects no doubt to the kind of conversations happening around soft games and games for comfort. Animal Crossing has been discussed as this kind of perfect, the confluence of pandemic and Animal Crossing.
I think there's something
been at least broadly like touched upon. Do you have any thoughts on it?
Yeah, I just think that there's something there. Like Animal Crossing, one of the pleasures of it is the kind of small changes within like a static kind of thing that you can check back up on, almost like gardening or I don't know, I'm trying to think of other metaphors, but you check back on it every day and subtle things change and evolve. Buildings get built, like your island kind of gets converted. I think JRPGs do that to like a linear narrative almost, like, so you're checking back in day after day, kind of taking it at its own pace. And I think the mood of this genre of games is like really essential to their enjoyment. It's like, I don't really remember a lot of story beats from like all the kind of JRPGs I've played, but I do remember like the mood and the tone. And I think that's something that we focused on in the class and tried to think about. It's also something I'm trying to think about with like what's going on with like kind of big JRPGs being released this year and small JRPGs being released this year. So something like Final Fantasy VII Remake came out kind of during the pandemic alongside Animal Crossing, and trying to figure out like what that means to be playing a game that's referencing a 20-year-old experience right now. Seems very strange and interesting in a way.
Yeah. So like maybe take us through what's the landscape of those JRPG games coming out in 2020 and these other kind of bigger experiences maybe that are being remade or remaking themselves.
Yeah, well, I'll say one thing, and that's that the RPG Maker engine itself, maybe to contextualize this question, is very specifically kind of a remake of some parts of Dragon Quest and some parts of Final Fantasy, from the screen resolution to the way the chibi sprites in the original art pack look, to the first-person battle system of like a Dragon Warrior Dragon Quest game. And I didn't mention it before, but one thing that's really fascinating to me about RPG Maker is these, since like, I think RPG Maker 2000, they've been programmed by a single person. So Yoji Ojima has been making RPG Maker by himself as like a solo programmer for ASCII and Enterbrain for RPG Maker 2000, RPG Maker XP, RPG Maker VX, RPG Maker VX Ace, RPG Maker MV. And so you can learn a lot about like his particular attitude towards JRPGs and what are the essential components of them. And so when you're working within that environment, you're kind of remaking Dragon Quest over and over again. And these systems came out at the same time that Enix was also moving into the Super Nintendo, but remaking the NES and Famicom versions of Dragon Quest for the Super Nintendo. So Dragon Quest 1 and 2 got re-released on the Super Nintendo using the Dragon Quest V engine. Dragon Quest 3 got re-released on the Super Nintendo using the Dragon Quest 6 engine, and so on. They released Dragon Quest V again for PlayStation 2, I think. Anyway, so they're remaking carefully the way that Nintendo re-releases Mario every year. Some JRPGs are being remade and re-released throughout their entire history. And I think this is one of the reasons that Dragon Quest is very popular in Japan and has kind of a lasting fan community. And so when I see things like Dragon Quest X, which is just like a love letter to the original Dragon Quests, it kind of does like a full-on Akira Toriyama art style in 3D at a high resolution, almost like a Ni no Kuni, like those games that almost look like an anime, but embedded, and there's spoilers, so you can like pause or tune out if you don't want spoilers, but there are memories of every single Dragon Quest game embedded in Dragon Quest X via the 2D mode, which you can play the entire game in 2D. So there's like an RPG Maker-esque 2D engine that they remade Dragon Quest X, shipped with the Switch version of the game, that has memories in Talkington, this like memory town, of all the other games where they remake specific towns, but something's like off about the town. So like the town in Dragon Quest II where your cousin has been transformed into a dog. When you go to that town in Dragon Quest X, everybody is a dog, and you have to like solve the puzzle to get it done.
This is very funny, not having played any of these games.
It's things like super fiddly, in-depth things, the way that the loading bar in like a new Mario game would use the 8-bit Mario or something. Or the loading bar in the new Fire Emblem game uses like the 8-bit original Fire Emblem graphics. They're doing that in Dragon Quest to kind of onboard all this stuff. Same thing with Final Fantasy VII Remake, right? Like, again, spoilers. Final Fantasy VII Remake, you encounter these ghosts throughout it. Every time the characters start to do something in a greater fidelity or with more detail than the original game, specters of the plot come in and they push you in the right direction to get you to do the game like you remember. But because of that, our characters become aware. Yeah, the original characters like Cloud Strife and all them become aware that there's this other thing going on, and certain characters with a greater connection to the planet, this isn't the diegesis of the game, know about that past plot. So the original Final Fantasy VII has happened already in the Final Fantasy VII Remake, diegetically. So there's something very weird going on with like thinking about the history of these games and how they reference one another. And I think that's also going on in indie production around JRPGs. So I think like Undertale has incredible, clear call-outs to other JRPGs like Mother or Yume Nikki, which is a RPG Maker game. The sprites from Yume Nikki make their way into Undertale. And I think games coming out right now like Get in the Car Loser by Christine Love, or Knuckle Sandwich by Andrew Brophy, or Hylix 2 by Mason Lindroth, She Dreams Elsewhere by Devion Gooden. Tammy Chang, who's the artist for Undertale, just put out a JRPG, Dweller's Empty Path. I think all these games are working within like a genre of reference where they're kind of citing and thinking about all these things from like this longer history of games. So there's this nostalgic impulse happening within this genre of storytelling.
And it feels like they're part of extending, remixing kind of a media cosmology with lots and lots of different deep roots.
Yeah, and I should be clear that like music is such a big part of this, like the way that the music works in these games. So I think Toby Fox is a really good example of a composer who, if you look at like the sample sheets for all the songs that Toby Fox makes for Undertale and Deltarune being like a remake of Undertale in a way, like it's also
an anagram as well.
Yep, but all those songs are like Chrono Trigger samples in this song, and it's referencing like the scene from Chrono Trigger, Earthbound samples in this song, and it's referencing the battle theme. So it's not so much the story beats or the scenario design as much as it is like the quality of the experience guided by like the art and music, I think, in a lot of these games that's producing that mood that puts you in that space of kind of this like solo storytelling genre. So yeah, very interesting to be playing JRPGs right now and having this kind of dense, layered kind of referentiality that is as much experiential as it is like storytelling beats or direct call outs. And I cut you off though, as you're wrapping it, probably cutting us because I hear
no. It's really irritating because I always have these like, oh, I really want to ask this question. I want to ask you about the politics of nostalgia.
Yeah,
but we've run out of time.
So, but that Rachel Simone Weil essay about nostalgia is a real good one for listeners.
There you go. Good. That's just pop off. Like, go find out about nostalgia. Patrick, it's been such a pleasure to chat with you and to really kind of be witness to your passion around RPGs and history of games and materiality and remaking as a process. Thank you so much for coming onto the Distillery.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me. Really appreciate it.
Great pleasure. See you soon. That was Patrick LeMieux, and this is The Distillery. I'm your host, Harry Lee Shanglun, and I get to talk with the coolest people about the coolest subjects. So you should check back. We have new guests every day, and our website, distillery.site, you can check out our previous episodes as well as future chats that we'll have. You can follow Instagram at distillery.site or on Twitter at distillery site. Thanks, everyone, and do take care. Bye.